Grace Mitchell was just picking up fresh produce at the farmer's market when a routine day took a shocking turn. Out of nowhere, she was arrested, accused of a crime she didn't commit, all because of one cop's racist assumptions. But when her husband, Marcus, stepped in, the tables began to turn. You won't believe what happens next. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching this from. What city or country? Grace Mitchell stood frozen in shock, the cold metal cuffs digging into her wrists as Officer Blake smirked, certain he'd caught a criminal in the middle of Oak Ridge's bustling farmer's market. I didn't do anything, Grace protested, her voice trembling. She glanced around, meeting the bewildered stares of her students and their parents. The vibrant colors of fresh produce and the cheerful chatter of the market faded into a distant blur. Officer Blake tightened his grip on her arm. Save it for the judge, lady. We got a call about a robbery at the jewelry store, and you fit the description. Grace's heart raced. But I've been here the whole time. Ask anyone. Shut it, Blake snapped, roughly steering her towards his patrol car. You people always have excuses. As Grace was shoved into the back seat, she caught sight of Marcus, her husband, pushing through the crowd. His face contorted with anger and disbelief. Grace, he called out, but the car door slammed shut, muffling his voice. At the police station, Grace sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under her eyes, accentuating her exhaustion and fear. Officer Blake paced around her, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. Where'd you stash the jewelry, Mitchell? I told you I didn't take anything, Grace insisted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I was at the farmer's market the entire time. Blake slammed his hands on the table, making Grace flinch. Cut the act. We both know your kind can't resist a 5-finger discount. Grace's eyes flashed with indignation. My kind? I'm a school teacher, not a thief. And what exactly do you mean by my kind, officer? Before Blake could respond, the door burst open. Marcus stormed in, followed closely by a stern-looking woman in a crisp suit. That's enough, officer, the woman declared. I'm Jasmine Reed, Mrs. Mitchell's attorney. This interrogation is over. Blake's face twisted with contempt. You can't just barge in here. I can and I will, Jasmine interrupted. You're holding my client without probable cause. Either charge her or release her immediately. Marcus moved to Grace's side, his hand on her shoulder. Are you okay, baby? Grace nodded, relief washing over her. I'm fine. But Marcus, I didn't do anything wrong. I know, honey. We'll figure this out. Blake sneered at the couple. How touching. But your wife's going nowhere until we get to the bottom of this. Jasmine stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. Officer Blake, I'm well aware of your history of racial profiling and misconduct. Unless you want me to add unlawful detention to the list of complaints I'll be filing, I suggest you uncuff my client now. A tense silence filled the room. Blake's jaw clenched, but he eventually relented, roughly removing Grace's handcuffs. As they left the station, Marcus pulled out his phone. I'm calling Ben. We need all the help we can get. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Grace took a deep breath, savoring her first taste of freedom in hours. Jasmine turned to the couple. Grace, I need you to tell me everything that happened today. Every detail matters. Grace recounted her morning at the farmer's market, describing the people she'd spoken to and the exact times she'd been at each stall. Marcus paced as he listened, his fists clenched. This is insane. How can they just arrest you without any evidence? Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think, Jasmine replied grimly. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Marcus, you mentioned calling someone named Ben. Marcus nodded. Yeah, Ben Stevens. We served together. He's got connections, might be able to help us gather some evidence. As if on cue, a beat-up pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a military-style haircut stepped out. Marcus, he called out, striding towards them. I came as soon as I could. What's the situation? Marcus quickly introduced Ben to Jasmine and filled him in on the details of Grace's arrest. Ben's expression darkened. Blake, That guy's bad news. I've heard stories about him from some of the guys down at the VFW. Jasmine nodded. We need to move fast. Our first priority is gathering evidence to prove Grace's innocence. Ben, you mentioned you have some connections. Any chance you could get us access to security footage from businesses near the jewelry store? Ben grinned. Leave it to me. I know a guy who owes me a favor. As Ben made some calls, Marcus turned to Grace. We should get you home. Rachel will be worried sick. Grace's eyes widened. Oh God, Rachel. She must be terrified. The drive home was tense, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily over them. As they pulled into their driveway, they spotted Rachel pacing on the front porch. The moment Grace stepped out of the car, Rachel ran to her, throwing her arms around her mother. Mom, are you okay? What happened? Grace held her daughter tight, fighting back tears. I'm okay, sweetie. It was all a big misunderstanding. Inside, as Grace recounted the day's events to Rachel, Marcus and Ben huddled in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. I got us access to the security footage from the cafe across from the jewelry store, Ben said. We can pick it up tomorrow morning. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. Good. We need to move fast. Blake's not going to let this go easily. As if to punctuate his words, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Rachel screamed, and everyone rushed to the living room. A brick lay on the floor, surrounded by shards of the broken window. Attached to it was a note. Go back where you came from. Marcus's face contorted with rage. He rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. A shadowy figure darted across their lawn, disappearing into the night. Hey! Marcus shouted, bolting for the front door. But by the time he reached the yard, the figure was gone. Ben joined him outside, scanning the area. Cowards, he muttered. You want me to stay the night, keep watch? Marcus shook his head. No, we'll be all right. But thanks, man, for everything. Back inside, Grace held a trembling Rachel close. Jasmine examined the brick and note, her expression grave. We need to document this, she said. It's evidence of harassment and intimidation. As Jasmine called the police to report the incident, Marcus knelt beside his wife and daughter. It's going to be okay, he assured them, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his eyes. We're going to get through this, together. Grace met his gaze, her fear giving way to determination. You're right. We've faced worse before. We won't let them break us. As the night wore on, the Mitchell family huddled close, drawing strength from each other. Outside, the shadows lengthened, hinting at the challenges that lay ahead. But within the warmth of their home, a spark of hope flickered to life, ready to ignite into a blaze of justice. The next morning, Marcus and Ben set out early to retrieve the security footage. The streets of Oak Ridge were quiet, the town still waking up to face another day. As they approached the cafe, a familiar figure stepped out from behind a parked car. Officer Blake, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming in the morning sun. Well, well, Blake drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. If it isn't the dynamic duo, out for a morning stroll. Marcus tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. We're not looking for trouble, Blake. No. Blake's eyes narrowed. Funny, 'cause trouble seems to follow you around, like that little incident at your house last night. Shame about that window. Ben stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You know something about that, Blake? The officer's hand drifted to his holster. Careful now. Wouldn't want to add assaulting an officer to your wife's charges, would we, Mitchell? Marcus's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. We're going to prove Grace's innocence, Blake. And when we do, you're going to wish you'd never laid eyes on her. Blake's smirk widened. Big words. But let me give you some friendly advice. Back off. You're way out of your depth here. With that, Blake turned and sauntered away, leaving Marcus and Ben seething on the sidewalk. Inside the cafe, the owner, a nervous man named Jerry, handed over a USB drive containing the security footage. I hope this helps, Jerry said, glancing anxiously at the door. But you didn't get this from me, okay? I don't want any trouble. Marcus nodded, pocketing the drive. We appreciate it, Jerry. You're doing the right thing. As they left the cafe, Ben clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Let's get this to Jasmine. If there's anything on here that can help Grace, she'll find it. Back at the Mitchell house, Jasmine pored over the footage, her eyes scanning every frame for clues. Grace sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Suddenly, Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes widening. Wait, what's this? On the screen, they could see Grace clearly visible at her market stall, chatting with customers. But in the background, partially obscured by a delivery truck, was a figure in a police uniform. Is that Officer Harris? Grace asked, leaning in for a closer look. Jasmine nodded slowly. It is. And look at what he's doing. They watched as Harris subtly slipped something into his pocket, glancing furtively around before moving out of frame. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What the hell is going on here? Jasmine's expression was grim. I don't know, but one thing's for sure. Officer Blake isn't working alone. This goes deeper than we thought. As the implications of their discovery sank in, a heavy silence fell over the room. The path to justice had just become far more treacherous, but for Grace and her family, there was no turning back now. The morning after discovering Officer Harris's suspicious behavior in the security footage, Marcus awoke to find Grace's side of the bed empty. He found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at a steaming mug of coffee. Couldn't sleep? Marcus asked, his voice soft with concern. Grace's fingers tightened around the mug. Every time I close my eyes, I see those handcuffs, feel them biting into my skin. Marcus moved to embrace her, but Grace flinched away. The hurt in his eyes was palpable. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't feel like myself anymore. Before Marcus could respond, Rachel stumbled into the kitchen, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Mom, do I have to go to school today? She asked, her voice small. Grace straightened, forcing a smile. Of course, sweetie. Education is important, remember? Rachel's shoulders slumped. But what if the other kids say something? What if they believe what Officer Blake said about you? The facade of strength Grace had been maintaining cracked. She pulled Rachel into a tight hug, her voice breaking as she spoke. You hold your head high, baby. We know the truth, and that's what matters. As Rachel left for school, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was Jasmine. Marcus, we've got a problem. Her voice crackled through the speaker. Blake's filed an official report. He's claiming he found stolen jewelry in your house during a routine search. Marcus's blood ran cold. That's impossible. He's never been inside our home. I know, but he's got evidence to back it up. We need to move fast. After hanging up, Marcus relayed the news to Grace. Her face paled, and she sank into a chair. How can they do this? She whispered. How can they just lie and get away with it? Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. They won't get away with it. I promise you, Grace. We're going to fight this. Across town, Ben was conducting his own investigation. He'd been asking around about Officer Blake, and the stories he heard made his stomach churn. As he left the VFW hall, a familiar face caught his eye. Harris. Ben called out. Officer Harris froze, then quickly ducked into an alley. Ben followed, his instincts on high alert. I saw you on that security footage, Ben said, cornering Harris. What's your role in all this? Harris's eyes darted nervously. You don't understand. It's bigger than just Blake. The whole system. It's rotten to the core. Before Ben could press further, Harris shoved past him and disappeared into the crowded street. That afternoon, Rachel walked home from school alone, her head down to avoid the stares and whispers of her classmates. As she turned onto her street, she noticed a group of boys following her. Hey, Mitchell, one of them called out. Is it true your mom's a thief? Rachel quickened her pace, but the boys caught up. My dad says people like you don't belong here, another taunted. Says you should go back where you came from. Rachel spun around, her fear giving way to anger. We were born here, just like you. This is our home. The lead boy sneered, raising his hand as if to strike her. Suddenly, a car horn blared, and the boys scattered. To Rachel's surprise, it was Mrs. Hernandez, her elderly neighbor. "Get in, Mija," she called out. "I'll drive you home." As they pulled up to the Mitchell house, Mrs. Hernandez turned to Rachel. "Your mother is a good woman. Don't let anyone tell you different." Rachel's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Inside, Marcus was on the phone with Jasmine when he heard the sound of breaking glass. He rushed to the living room to find a brick lying amidst shattered window panes, a note attached, "Leave or else." Marcus's hands shook as he dialed 911, but when the dispatcher asked for his address, he hesitated. Could he trust the police to help them? As night fell, the Mitchell family huddled in their living room, the boarded-up window a stark reminder of the threat looming over them. Grace sat with Rachel, stroking her hair and murmuring words of comfort. Marcus paced restlessly, his mind racing. "We need to do something," he muttered. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come after us again." Ben, who had arrived shortly after the brick incident, nodded grimly. "I agree, but we need to be smart about this. Blake's got the upper hand right now." Jasmine, her laptop open on the coffee table, looked up. "I've been going through Blake's past cases. There's a pattern of misconduct, but it's always been swept under the rug. If we could find someone willing to testify." A knock at the door made everyone freeze. Marcus approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. His eyes widened in surprise. "It's Harris," he whispered. After a moment of tense debate, they decided to let him in. Harris entered, his uniform rumpled, and his eyes darting nervously. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "But I can't keep quiet anymore. Blake, he's been running a protection racket for years. The jewelry store robbery, it was staged to cover up a bigger operation." The room fell silent as the implications of Harris's words sank in. "Why are you telling us this now?" Jasmine asked, her tone cautious. Harris's shoulders slumped. "Because I'm tired of being part of the problem. And because what's happening to your family, it's not right." As Harris shared more details about Blake's operation, a plan began to form. They would need evidence, witnesses, and above all, courage to take on not just Blake, but the entire corrupt system he represented. The next morning, Marcus stood outside the police station, his heart pounding. He'd insisted on confronting Blake alone, despite Grace and Jasmine's objections. As Blake exited the building, Marcus called out, "We need to talk." Blake's lips curled into a sneer. "Come to beg for mercy, Mitchell?" "I know what you've been doing," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The protection racket, the false arrests. It ends now." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You're in over your head, Mitchell. Back off while you still can." "Or what?" Marcus challenged. "You'll plant more evidence. Threaten my family again." Blake's composure cracked. He lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the shirt. "Listen here, you." Marcus didn't flinch. "Go ahead, do it. Show everyone who you really are." A crowd had begun to gather, phones out, recording the confrontation. Blake released Marcus, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed before storming back into the station. As Marcus turned to leave, he noticed Officer Harris watching from a distance. Their eyes met, and Harris gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Back at home, Marcus recounted the confrontation to Grace and Jasmine. Grace's face was a mix of pride and fear. "Was that wise?" she asked, provoking him like that. Marcus took her hand. "We can't live in fear anymore, Grace. It's time to take a stand." Jasmine nodded approvingly. "It's risky, but it might just work. Blake's bound to make a mistake now that he's rattled." As they discussed their next move, Rachel burst into the room, her face pale. "Mom, Dad, you need to see this." She held out her phone, showing a social media post that was rapidly spreading through the community. It was a doctored photo of Grace, seemingly caught in the act of stealing jewelry. Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "How could they do this?" Marcus's jaw clenched. "This ends now. We're going to the media. It's time to tell our story." As they prepared to leave, a car pulled up outside. Through the window, they saw Officer Harris step out, his expression grim. "I need to talk to you," he called out. "It's about Blake. He's planning something big, and you're all in danger." The Mitchells exchanged worried glances. The stakes had just been raised, and they knew that whatever came next would change their lives forever. Officer Harris's warning hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of impending danger. Marcus, Grace, and Jasmine exchanged wary glances, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. "What exactly is Blake planning?" Marcus demanded, his voice tight with tension. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the windows as if expecting Blake to materialize at any moment. "He's fabricating evidence, lots of it. Not just against Grace, but against you too, Marcus. He's building a case to paint you both as part of a larger criminal network." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But that's absurd. We've never—" "It doesn't matter what's true," Harris interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "Blake's got half the force in his pocket, and the other half too scared to speak up. He's going to bury you both unless we act fast." Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Are you offering to help us, Officer Harris?" Harris nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face. "I can't stand by any more. What Blake's doing, it's not just corrupt, it's evil. But we need to be smart about this. Blake's got eyes and ears everywhere." As they huddled together, formulating a plan, Rachel watched from the stairs, her young face etched with worry. The adults' hushed voices and tense postures spoke volumes about the gravity of their situation. Across town, Officer Blake sat in his dimly lit office, a smug smile playing on his lips as he reviewed the fabricated evidence spread across his desk. Photos, documents, and false witness statements, all meticulously crafted to ensure the Mitchells' downfall. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in," he barked. A nervous-looking rookie officer entered, clutching a file. "Sir, I've got the reports you asked for, but are you sure about this?" "It seems." Blake's eyes flashed dangerously. "Seems what, Johnson? Illegal? Unethical? Let me remind you of your place. You follow orders, or you'll find yourself on the wrong side of that thin blue line." "Understood." The rookie swallowed hard, nodding before retreating hastily. As dawn broke, Marcus and Ben found themselves in the shadowy recesses of the police station's archives, their hearts pounding in their chests. Harris had tipped them off about crucial evidence hidden away, proof of Blake's long-standing corruption. "It should be in this section," Ben whispered, his fingers skimming file labels. Suddenly, a noise from the corridor froze them in place. Footsteps approached, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's mind raced. If they were caught here, it would be game over. Everything they'd fought for would crumble in an instant. The door handle turned, and in a split-second decision, Marcus shoved Ben behind a filing cabinet, positioning himself in plain sight. Officer Blake stepped in, his eyes widening in surprise before narrowing with malicious glee. Well, breaking and entering, Mitchell? You're making this too easy." Marcus stood his ground, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I know what you're doing, Blake, and I'm not going to let you destroy my family or this community." Blake's laugh was cold and mirthless. Big words from a man about to go to prison. "You're finished, Mitchell. You and your thief of a wife." As Blake moved to restrain Marcus, Ben emerged from his hiding spot, tackling Blake to the ground. In the ensuing scuffle, Marcus managed to grab a file, the one Harris had described, before they both bolted from the room. Alarms blared as they raced through the station, dodging officers and leaping over obstacles. They burst out into the early morning light, sprinting towards Ben's waiting car. As they sped away, Marcus clutched a file to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We did it, Ben. We got it." But their elation was short-lived. As they pored over the documents back at the Mitchell house, their hearts sank. The file was incomplete. Crucial pages were missing, leaving them with tantalizing hints of Blake's corruption, but no smoking gun. Jasmine's face was grim as she reviewed what they had. It's not enough. We need more if we're going to take Blake down. Grace, who had been silent throughout their discussion, suddenly spoke up. Then we'll get more. We've come too far to give up now. Her words galvanized the group, reigniting their determination. But as they strategized their next move, a commotion outside drew their attention. A crowd had gathered on their lawn, some holding signs supporting Grace, others demanding justice against her. The community was fracturing, tensions rising to a boiling point. Marcus stepped out onto the porch, facing the crowd. He raised his hands, calling for silence. I know you're all scared and confused, but I'm asking you to listen, really listen, to what's happening here. As Marcus spoke, sharing their story and the injustices they'd faced, something remarkable began to happen. People started to listen, really listen. Faces that had been twisted with anger softened, replaced by looks of concern and understanding. From the back of the crowd, a voice rang out. He's right. Blake's been harassing my family for years. Another chimed in. He threatened to arrest my son if we didn't pay him off. Suddenly, the floodgates opened. Person after person stepped forward, sharing their own experiences of Blake's corruption and abuse of power. In that moment, Marcus realized they'd been looking at this all wrong. The evidence they needed wasn't hidden away in some dusty file. It was right here, in the voices and experiences of their community. As the impromptu gathering grew, news vans began to arrive, drawn by the commotion. Reporters thrust microphones towards Marcus, hungry for the story. Jasmine stepped forward, her legal mind already spinning. We need to organize this. Get statements. Build a case. This is our chance to expose Blake and the entire corrupt system. But even as hope blossomed, danger lurked. Blake, alerted to the gathering, arrived with a squad of officers, his face contorted with rage. Disperse immediately, he bellowed, his hand resting ominously on his holster. The crowd tensed, fear battling with newfound courage. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Blake and the community he'd sworn to protect. No more Blake, Marcus declared, his voice ringing with authority. Your reign of terror ends today. Blake's hand tightened on his weapon, his eyes wild. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed he might actually draw his gun. But then, a voice cut through the tension. Stand down, Blake. Officer Harris emerged from the crowd, his badge held high. It's over. I've already contacted Internal Affairs. They're on their way. Blake's face drained of color as he realized the tide had turned against him. His supporters in the force began to back away, unwilling to go down with him. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, the crowd erupted in cheers. Marcus turned to embrace Grace, tears of relief and joy streaming down their faces. But their battle was far from over. As the adrenaline of the moment faded, the reality of their situation set in. They had exposed Blake, yes, but the systemic issues that allowed his corruption to flourish remained. Jasmine, ever the strategist, was already planning their next moves. This is just the beginning. We need to push for real reform, for accountability. Grace nodded, her eyes shining with determination. And we will, together. As the sun set on this tumultuous day, the Mitchell family stood united, surrounded by a community that had found its voice. They had faced injustice and emerged stronger, but the real work was just beginning. Marcus looked out at the faces of his neighbors, seeing hope where there had once been division. We didn't just fight for justice, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We fought for each other, and that's how we'll build a better future. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but as they stood there, hand in hand, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next. For in exposing the darkness, they had found a light of unity, of courage, and of unwavering hope for change. The Oak Ridge Courthouse loomed before Grace Mitchell, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the injustice she'd faced. She squeezed Marcus's hand, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. You ready? Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble of determination. Grace nodded, her chin held high. As I'll ever be. They ascended the steps, flanked by Jasmine and Ben. A sea of reporters surged around them, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Mrs. Mitchell, how do you respond to the charges? Mr. Mitchell, do you believe this is racially motivated? Jasmine stepped forward, her voice cutting through the clamor. No comments at this time. Justice will speak for itself today. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Officer Blake sat at the prosecution table, his smug expression faltering as he caught sight of the Mitchells' resolute faces. As the judge entered and proceedings began, Marcus leaned towards Jasmine. Are you sure about this? Jasmine's eyes glinted with determination. Trust me, it's our only shot. The prosecutor rose, painting a damning picture of Grace as a criminal mastermind. With each word, the air in the courtroom grew heavier, hope slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Then, it was Jasmine's turn. She stood, her presence commanding attention. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to call an unexpected witness. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Officer Harris entered, his face a mask of grim determination. Blake's eyes widened in shock. He leaned towards his lawyer, whispering furiously. Harris took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he was sworn in. Jasmine approached. Officer Harris, can you tell the court about the events surrounding Mrs. Mitchell's arrest? Harris took a deep breath. It was all a setup. Officer Blake orchestrated the whole thing. The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Explain yourself, Officer Harris, the judge demanded. Harris's words tumbled out, a dam of truth finally breaking. He detailed Blake's years of corruption, the false arrests, the planted evidence, the intimidation of witnesses. And Mrs. Mitchell, Jasmine prodded. She was innocent. Blake chose her because he knew no one would question it if we arrested a black woman. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace closed her eyes, tears of vindication streaming down her face. Marcus wrapped an arm around her, his jaw clenched with a mix of anger and relief. Blake exploded from his seat. He's lying. This is all a conspiracy. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Order. Officer Blake, sit down or I'll have you removed. As Harris's testimony continued, the full extent of the corruption unfolded. It wasn't just Blake. It was a systemic issue that had festered for years. When Harris finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The judge, his face grave, turned to the prosecutor. In light of this testimony, how does the state wish to proceed? The prosecutor, visibly shaken, stood. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Grace Mitchell. A cheer erupted from the gallery. Grace collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobs of relief racking her body. The judge nodded. Motion granted. Mrs. Mitchell, you are free to go. Officer Blake, you are hereby remanded into custody pending an investigation into these allegations. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, he locked eyes with Marcus. His smirk sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This isn't over, Blake mouthed. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. As the Mitchells emerged, a roar of support went up. Rachel pushed through, flinging herself into her parents' arms. It's over, Grace whispered, holding her family close. It's finally over. But Marcus knew better. This was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Oak Ridge was a town transformed. The exposure of Blake's corruption sparked a movement for change. Town hall meetings overflowed as citizens demanded accountability and reform. Grace, once ostracized, found herself at the center of this push for justice. Her quiet dignity and unwavering strength had become a rallying point for the community. One evening, as the Mitchells sat on their porch, watching the sunset, Jasmine arrived with news. The state's launching a full investigation into the police department, she announced. They're talking about complete overhaul, new training programs, community oversight. Marcus nodded, a mix of satisfaction and weariness in his eyes. It's a start, but we've got a long road ahead. Grace reached for his hand, but we'll walk it together, all of us. As if on cue, neighbors began to appear. Mrs. Hernandez, who had sheltered Rachel. Jerry from the cafe, whose footage had been crucial. Even Officer Harris, tentatively approaching with an offering of peace. One by one, they gathered on the Mitchells' lawn. Black, white, brown, a tapestry of faces united in their desire for change. Rachel watched in awe. "Mom, Dad, look at this. Look at what you started." Marcus stood, addressing the impromptu gathering. "We didn't start this. We just refused to let it be finished. What happens next is up to all of us." As the crowd murmured in agreement, a car pulled up. A man in a suit stepped out. The mayor. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," he called out, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I was hoping we could talk about the future of Oak Ridge." Grace and Marcus exchanged glances. This was their moment, a chance to turn their pain into progress. "We're listening," Grace said, her voice steady and strong. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the gathering, the seeds of change were planted. Discussions of community policing, educational programs, and economic initiatives flowed freely. In the midst of it all, Marcus pulled Grace aside. "You know, when I married you, I never imagined we'd end up leading a movement." Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy that had been absent for too long. "Oh, please, you. The man who ran into burning buildings for a living? I always knew you had it in you to change the world." Their moment was interrupted by Rachel, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, Dad, come quick. They want to form a youth council, and they're asking if I'll help lead it." As they watched their daughter step into her own as a leader, Marcus and Grace felt a swell of pride. They had fought not just for themselves, but for her future, for everyone's future. The night wore on. Plans were made, committees formed. As the last of the neighbors departed, promises of tomorrow's work still buzzing in the air, the Mitchell family stood together on their porch. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Grace leaned into him, her strength, and is perfectly balanced. "No, my love, we're just getting started." Rachel, caught up in the moment, threw her arms around them both. "I love you guys. We're going to change everything, aren't we?" Marcus chuckled, ruffling her hair. "One step at a time, kiddo. One step at a time." As they turned to go inside, a flicker of movement caught Marcus's eye. Across the street, a figure stood in the shadows, Blake, out on bail and watching them with cold eyes. For a moment, fear threatened to overtake him. But then Grace's hand found his, warm and steady. Rachel's laughter drifted from inside the house, and Marcus realized that they had already won the most important battle. They were whole, they were together, and they were unafraid. He met Blake's gaze, not with anger or defiance, but with something the corrupt officer could never understand: hope. Then, without a backward glance, Marcus stepped inside, closing the door on the darkness and embracing the light of a new dawn. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the love of his family and the promise of a better tomorrow, Marcus finally understood. They hadn't just fought for justice or for each other. They had fought for the very soul of their community, and in doing so, they had found their own. As he held Grace close, their heartbeats synchronizing in the stillness, Marcus whispered, "We didn't just change Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge changed us." Grace smiled, her eyes reflecting a future bright with possibility. And that, my love, is the greatest victory of all.